Thank you, and good morning, friends. A warm welcome to each one of you. The topic we are about to discuss, when hate goes viral, being Muslim in India, is an extremely crucial one, not just for India, but for each of us as Indians. Yet I wish we did not have to discuss it. The very fact that it figures in an online literature festival like this one that bears the title Belong is a reminder that there are many of us who are often made to feel that they do not belong to the Republic. What does this say of that long expected tryst with destiny? Is Faiz Ahmed Faiz's words, "This surely isn't the dawn we waited for so eagerly," coming true? Was this a tryst with hatred along communal and caste lines? Was this dawn of expectation just a dawn of viciousness, of othering? We are conscious that a topic as complex as this cannot be covered in a short time that we have for this discussion. 45 minutes of presentations, followed by half an hour of questions from the audience. But even if we succeed in alerting ourselves to some of the important points of the othering of the Muslim in India, we believe it will be a valuable discussion. To try and evolve, and here I would take a bit of a liberty with the format that has been decided, in the sense that I thought, let me put all the questions that we arrived at through a process of discussion so that the audience too is on the same page with us. And so these are the questions. We kept about 5 questions, and I repeat them here. What are some of the social, political, and historical factors that have contributed to this present moment? And how much of this hate is manufactured versus being deeply embedded in Indian society? Are there specific moments when hate crimes register a sharp rise, as for instance, before an election or during a pandemic like the one we are going through? How has this sharp spike of hate impacted Muslim identity personally as well? Will this graph of hate crime keep rising in the immediate and more long-term future, according to you, given state-directed policies like Citizens Amendment Act, National Register of Citizens, National Population Register, and so on? And finally, and this is important, and I hope we have some time for it, how might one imagine a more inclusive India for all religious identities? So with this, let me kick off the discussion. And to participate in this conversation, we have 3 fine minds. Let me introduce them in the order that they will be speaking, each for around 10 minutes or a little over. Our next speaker is Khalid Anis Ansari, who is presently director, Dr. Ambedkar Center for Exclusion Studies and Transformation Action, Global University, India. Ansari works in the field of social and cultural theory, combining grassroots organizing with scholarly interventions for publicizing the aspirations of the subordinate caste of the Pasmanda Muslims. I think this is an important aspect of your work, and I don't know if it'll figure in the discussion, but it will be good if it does. He was awarded the HEVOS PhD fellowship, and the subject of his thesis was pluralism knowledge program was on pluralism and the knowledge combination. His doctoral work was on caste movements specifically among Indian Muslims with the University of Humanistic Studies, Utrecht, the Netherlands. He has published widely in both academic and popular, press. And I would like to now invite Khalid to tell us what he has to tell us. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone.
Good.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Pamela and Professor Habib, for contextualizing the discussion today. Uh, the questions that were raised by Pamela are too general in nature, and I don't know whether I'll be able to do justice in such a short span of time. But I'd like to flag a few issues from the vantage point of the Pasmanda movement, the movement of lower caste Muslims that I've been studying for the last few years. So to begin with, I'll begin with a few premises. First, I see caste as the storehouse of power in South Asia that organizes the domain of knowledge, wealth, sexuality, violence, and so on and so forth. So caste basically directs the political economy, and it is about the control of symbolic and material resources by the upper caste elite. My second premise is that caste is a system of, it's a hierarchical system. It's a system of graded inequality where there is an increasing scale of reverence and a decreasing scale of contempt. And Dr. Ambedkar suggested that caste could be seen as gangs, as cliques, as self-serving cliques, and therefore caste as a unit or caste as a system is also anti-national, because various castes in the hierarchical order, they share feelings of distrust, feelings of envy, feelings of mutual jealousy, and so on and so forth. So that is the second premise. My third premise is that we should not see caste as a religious phenomena or a Hindu phenomena, but caste should be seen as a South Asian phenomena, so which cuts across religious identities. So in the case of Muslims, there is a traditional distinction between the Ashrafs, which are the upper caste Muslims that constitute about 15% of Muslim population. Then there are the Pasmanda Muslims, which is a category which encompasses the Shudra Muslims, the backward Shudra Muslims, the Dalit Muslims, and the Adivasi Muslims. So the Pasmanda Muslims, which is an omnibus category comprising of the backward Dalit Adivasi Muslims, it constitutes about 85% of Muslim population. So when we talk about the Muslim category and what does being Muslim in India mean, then coming from the Pasmanda vantage point, I would say that Muslim is not a monolithic community, but it is divided into 705 occupational jatis, biradaris, or groups. And the experience of Muslims would be different for different caste groups within the Muslim body politic. Now, once these three premises are clear, then we could go for a historical interpretation of the hatred that we face today, or the anti-Muslim bigotry that we face today. So I would go back to the colonial regime and how the colonial knowledge politics has a very robust role to play in whatever is staged as violence or as hatred in the contemporary. Now, obviously, we cannot go too back in history, but one of the very interesting things with the colonial regime installed was the hypervalorization of religion as a category, was this understanding that religion is the overarching category in South Asia. So this construction of an all India Hindu or a Muslim community, communities with deep diversity within, it could be seen as the foundational violence which informs the violence in the last 150 years or so. So there are critical moments in the modern national history from 1850s onwards at least. So 1906, we see the formation of the Muslim League. 1909, the Minto-Morley reforms, 1960 Lucknow Pact, which sealed the idea of a separate electorate for Muslims and objectified Muslims as an all India community. Then 1919 Montague-Chelmsford reforms, which installed semi-parliamentary practices, the idea of elections, and the expansion of the franchise. So in 1919, for the first time, we are seeing a shift from elite politics to some semblance of mass politics. And this shift is very important because once you install the logic of democracy, then numbers become important. And when numbers become important, the higher caste sections within all religious identities, they feel an anxiety. And this democratic game installed from 1919 onward, we see two parallel movements. One is the movement of the politicization of lower caste across communities. So we see the politicization of Dalit Bahujan communities among so-called Hindus, and the movement of lower caste Muslim movements in the form of the Moment Conference from at least the 1920s onwards. So at one level, we see the politicization of lower caste movements across religious communities. At another level, we see the high caste sections, both within Hindus and Muslims, latching on to the Hindu or Muslim identity as a proxy for their own interests. So when we talk about the category Muslim or category Hindu from a Bahujan vantage point, it actually is a euphemism for higher caste Savarn Hindus or the higher caste Ashraf Muslims. So the so-called Hindu experience or the so-called Muslim experience is largely informed by the concerns of higher caste groups across these communities. And this is very important because at least till the 1920s, if you look at the writings of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, then in Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's writings, the term Qaum or community actually refers to the higher caste sections. For example, there's a famous speech by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in 1887, where he refers to the Muslims, the term Qaum, as the Hashimis, the Sayyids, the Pathans, the Qurayshis, and so on and so forth. So the term Qaum was largely reserved for upper caste Muslims, and for the lower caste Muslims, the term Awam was used, the commons or the plebeians, so to say. So I'm not saying that there was no sense of being a Hindu or being a Muslim pre-1850s. But what I'm suggesting is that after 1850s, there is a systematization of religious identity, which is very different from what constituted the religious experience pre-1850s. So, in the first census, 1872, when the returns were out, that was the first time when it was revealed that the majority of Muslims are native converts rather than the descendants of immigrant Muslims. And it is around the 1920s when the lower caste Muslims become a feather in the cap of Islam in India. So the drama unfolds from 1920s onwards as democracy deepens and as the politicization of lower caste happens. And that is where the upper caste Muslims, they respond through the forces of so-called Hindu nationalism or Muslim nationalism. Even the so-called secular nationalism is informed by and large, the Hindu upper caste imagery, the Savarn imagery. So I'll come back to that later. But the key point that I want to flag is that while caste is the principle of fragmentation, it is a principle of graded inequality. It is a principle which minoritizes. Religion, on the other hand, or religious nationalism, on the other hand, is the principle of forming a political majority by the high caste sections across religions. And these two logics, the logics of caste and the logic of religion, they militate against each other. And this threat to the higher caste hegemony, this threat to the higher caste dominant across religions from the internal others, from the lower caste, from the women, from the sexual minorities, it is usually managed by displacing the antagonism to the external other. This mutual othering of Hindus and Muslims is a construct. It is manufactured in order to manage the internal challenge from the lower castes, the women, and the sexual minorities, and so on and so forth. And this mutual hatred, which was installed in the colonial era, has largely continued even in the post-colonial Indian scenario. So we see in the last many years, we see the racialization of the Hindu and Muslim community. And this racialization, it is an impossible operation because of the fragmentation of the Hindu and Muslim community into various castes, into various other identities. Since it is an impossible operation, this racialization is not possible without some kind of intellectual, cognitive, and physical violence. And that is where two logics emerge. One is the micropolitics of faith, the so-called axis of piety. So we see satsang, we see tabligh jamaat, and so on and so forth, which reproduces the Hindu and Muslim day in and day out in the form of religious institutions, in the form of the domain of piety. And at the second level, we see the riot or the pogrom as the ubiquitous phenomena from at least from 1850s, 70s onwards. And this riot or pogrom is not a spontaneous. It is not a spontaneous phenomena. This riot or pogrom is a deliberate construct. It is manufactured, it is engineered. And Paul Brazis uses the interesting phrase, the riot apparatus in India. So this violence is employed in order to construct the Hindu and Muslim. Dr. Ambedkar very clearly said that if there was no communal violence, there would be no Hindu, because it is only during the phenomena of communal violence that the Hindu community divided into various castes comes together. So what Dr. Ambedkar said about Hinduism is equally true about Muslims, because Muslims are also divided into 705 caste groups, into various sects, into various other identities, various other internal identities. And it is only the program of the riot which actually unites them into a community. It's a temporary unity, but it's a unity which works to the advantage of the high caste sections, which consolidate their politics through the Hindu-Muslim binary, through the majoritarian-minority binary, through the Islamophilia binary, through the secularism-communalism binary. I mean, if you look at all these four binaries which manage the caste order in India, then both sides of these binary are dominated by the higher caste sections. Whether you take secularism, you look at all the secular institutions, secular parties, so on and so forth. You take the communal organizations, you take minority organizations, you take majority organizations, you take Islamophobia, the axis of Islamophobia or the axis of Islamophilia. It is always dominated by the higher caste sections across religions. So now, I'll just conclude by saying that there is a symbiotic relationship between Hindu and Muslim communalism. And when I say there is a symbiotic relationship, I'm not saying that these are equivalent, that Hindu communalism is equivalent to Muslim communalism. What I'm saying is, number one, that Muslim communalism, it provides a legitimating vocabulary to the Hindu right-wing forces. And second, that majority and minority, despite their internal tensions, despite their overt tensions, they always negotiate to a certain kind of equilibrium at the expense of the broad Bahujan masses across religions. I can cite a few instances of negotiations and also how this entire notion of legitimating vocabulary works. So look at the statements of the Owaisi brothers in the last few years, or the statement of someone like Waris Pathan, who says that 15 crore Muslims can tackle 100 crore Hindus and so on, or the statement of Imran Masood, who says Modi ke tukre tukre kar denge, or the recent controversy over Zafar Islam Khan's statement. And the recent there's a Twitter controversy going on about homosexuality. Why so why so proud? So all these kinds of statements, they provide a legitimating vocabulary and they consolidate the Hindutva forces. As far as negotiations are concerned, so there are various sites where the upper caste Hindus and Muslims, they negotiate with each other. For example, Maulana Saad, very recent this Tabligh Jamaat event during the Corona crisis. So we see NSA Ajit Doval having a midnight discussion with Maulana Saad. Then there is another organization which was formed in the last few months, which is a think tank of 200 or 300 Muslim elite led by MJ Khan, who's very close to one of the BJP leaders. So negotiations are happening. And then the ulama, especially the Jamatul Ulama Hind, defending the Citizenship Amendment Act on behalf of the present day government. Then Patanjali Baba Ramdev, the Patanjali brand, it was offered a halal certificate by the Jamatul Ulama Hind very recently. Or we can take the example of a conference in BHU a few years back, where Mr. Indresh Kumar, a key RSS functionary who works on Muslim issues, he was invited by an SIO, Jamaat-e-Islami-led student organization, for a discussion. So all these kinds of discussions between majority and minority groups, obviously led by the higher caste across religious groups, they keep on happening day in and day out. And this hatred and this mutual violence, it actually works against the subordinated caste across religions. So I will just stop here. And I would say that the fundamental driving force of the hatred today is the monopoly and the domination of higher caste sections over symbolic and material resources. And the more the democracy deepens, the more the higher caste sections, they respond by violence, they respond by hate. And unless we democratize the material and symbolic resources of the country, unless there is equitable distribution, this violence is not going to stop. And we need to think outside the binaries of Hindu, Muslim, majority, minority, secularism, communalism, Islamophobia, Islamophilia, and so on and so forth. I'll stop here and probably follow these few points later during the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
You're on mute, Pamela. Pamela, could you unmute yourself?
Thank you so much, Ansari Saab. You have actually taken what Professor Irfan Habib had talked about and expanded and given it that caste, that crucial caste dimension. And I think that formulation that caste is anti-national is something that we need to really put out there in front in capital letters, just as communalism is anti-national. And caste as a South Asian phenomenon, it's not limited to India. It is part of this region. And what is disturbing in your presentation was the way in which the upper castes have dominated the politics of this period. And later, perhaps when we have time, we can even look at whether it was the upper caste that dominated the national movement as well, you know, and whether some of the tensions that we are now seeing playing out was not adequately attended to at that crucial juncture in our history. We have about 15 minutes before we could go to the audience. And in this discussion, I'd like to flag 3 points that emerged from the very valuable presentations made this morning. And to go to Professor Habib's point, that the legacy of this battle against one's own people actually predates today's India, but its persistence and the new forms it has taken is something that can be looked at a little more closely. Coming to Professor Ansari's point, I think the reproducing of hierarchies and hatreds through religious organizations, through riots and pogroms, and I'm glad you cited Bras, because Bras also brings in this interpretation of riots as a very important way of how the riot lives on in the minds of people. And and also the symbiotic relationship between Hindu and Muslim communalism and its a higher caste nature. I think that is something that we can pause and look at a little closely. And
Yeah.
Professor Ansari, can you take it forward, some of the points that Annie has put before us within your own framework, which I find quite compelling?
Yeah, well, I would just add, or rather emphasize on a few things that I touched during my presentation. Uh, I also read a few question and answers on the chat block. So I would respond to those as well. So when I say that there is a symbiotic relationship between Hindu and Muslim communalism, the idea is not to equate the two. The point that is being made is not in terms of firepower. Obviously, RSS is a much bigger organization than Jamaat-e-Islami, with a larger cadre base than any Muslim organization. But the point that I am stressing is that Hindu and Muslim communalism, they are co-constitutive in nature. They reproduce each other. And if Islamism is led by the Sayyadwadis, the term that we use is Sayyadwad, then the Hindutva is used by the Brahminical forces or the Brahmanwadis, right? And there is a cause and effect relationship between the two. There is a tension between these two forms of nationalism or communalism, but they usually arrive at an equilibrium sooner than later, an equilibrium which is at the expense of the Bahujan subaltern caste across religions. So that is the first point that I would like to make. The second point is when we talk about the victims, the Muslim victims, during communal pogroms, during lynchings, and so on and so forth, then obviously Muslims as a class, Muslim as a group, they are vulnerable, but there is a variegated nature to vulnerability. And this Muslim vulnerability, it has to be complicated through spatial and class categories. For example, I'll just give a few examples. Let us take the Muzaffarnagar violence. So when the violence was actually happening, then there's a community of when the gangs, the rioters, when they were attacking Muslims, then there was a neighborhood of Muslim Jats who are known as the Mule Jats, and these gangs spared them because these Mule Jats, they are dominant communities in the region. So if we characterize Muzaffarnagar riots as an anti-Muslim violence, it would be okay at one level, but at another level, it also hides much more than it reveals, because most of the victims in the Muzaffarnagar violence were lower caste Muslims or the Pasmanda Muslims. If we take the Northeast Delhi, the recent riots in the Northeast Delhi, then what are the kind of people who constitute these neighborhoods? We'll find there are a number of migrants, skilled migrant workers from Western UP. They have migrated to these regions. So we have to complicate this anti-Muslim violence in terms of class, in terms of space, in terms of caste, and only then we get to a much more realistic picture. Related to this is the distance between the actual victims and the beneficiaries of the politics of victimhood. So the actual victims are largely the lower class, lower caste Muslims, women, and so on and so forth, while the beneficiaries of the politics of victimhood, the NGOs, the civil society operators, the journalists, the academics who represent this violence or who reap benefits from this politics of victimhood, they are largely higher caste, whether Muslims or Hindus. So
Yeah.
that is the second.
Yeah. Can we?
I have more things to say anyway.
Yeah, I know, but I wanted to go to the audience, and I think there was. I'll start with a question from Rana Khan. What is this normalization all about? Why is hate normalized? And what are the ways in which this normalization takes place? It's a very complex question. We cannot answer it in a short time, but I just wanted to put it there. And I think all of you can see the questions that are coming up in your box. So can you just respond to some of them? Because we now have only about 10 minutes at our disposal. So in the short time we have, which is about 5 minutes each.
Khalid has more questions here.
No, I don't know. I mean, it will take. I'll just talk about this question of normalization. So, if the thesis is correct that this violence is in order to restore the slipping hegemony of the higher caste from 1990s onwards, so I would say this violence was restorative violence from 1990s onwards. In recent years, from 2014 onwards, I would see this violence as expansionist violence. So the Savarna high caste groups, they're expanding their hegemony. So if this link between this hatred and violence with high caste hegemony, if this link is clear, then this normalization of violence cannot be fought unless that hegemony is ruptured. So that is what I have to say on the question of normalization. This is going to stay for long, and we have to fight it out democratically, obviously.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ansari Saab, would you like to weigh in on some?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, othering and antagonism is part and parcel of all kinds of politics. The only issue is what kind of othering are we willing to choose and flag? So from the vantage point of Pasmanda movement, the Pasmanda movement has contested this idea of vertical solidarity on the level of faith, whether sare Hindu ek ho jao or sare Musliman ek ho jao. And it has urged for a counter-hegemonic pan-religion solidarity of subordinated caste, as encompassed in their slogan, Dalit Pichhda Ek Saman, Hindu ho ya Musliman. That is at one level. And the second, they have inverted the identity. For example, Ali Anwar, the leader of Pasmanda movement, he says, "हम शुद्धर हैं शुद्धर, पहले मूल निवासी हैं, बाद में मुसलमान हैं." So he's inverting this entire notion of identity by placing caste identity as the primary identity when compared to religion. So I will stop here.
That is a very interesting point you made, Dr. Ansari. And I think with this, we come to the end of the session. It has been a very intense discussion, and it has had its uncomfortable moments. In fact, I feel uncomfortable talking of Muslims as a category apart, because I feel, in a sense, we need to realize that they are part of us. Part of us, when I say us, we are talking of we the people. And what we have seen is a complete unpacking of that idea and the atomization of the idea of we the people. And therefore, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think we shouldn't be too dispirited. We need to carry on. And I think the future is with us, because the future is with all right-thinking people, I would say.
Yeah.
The struggles on the way are many.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.